So I was asked to give a proper deck tech and go over some of the card choices in Blue-Red Reenact the Crime. I haven't come up with a better name for that. You are a criminal. Be gray. Do crimes. I'm not really sure. But let's go over some of the specifics, including like the distribution of all these like top-end cards. So there's one top-end card that we're not seeing. It's technically the only sorcery in the deck, and that's Seagate Restoration. I haven't got to actually, like, flash it back, but I figured one would not significantly be painful enough that it would really hurt my chances of actually winning the game. Like, paying 3 life once is not going to kill me most of the time, and that has been the case. It's been fine as just an additional land, and the one time I got a chance to cast it got countered. So, limited testing, I'm not sure if this is a good decision. As far as the other choices, I'm not sure if the split between Emrakul and Ulamog is right. Ulamog has actually seemed better and better the more I play with the deck, so realistically, the number might be 3-2 or 1 or 4-1 in Ulamog's favor. But either way, the Eldrazi are particularly good options, and 5 to 6 of them seems right to be able to do that. The Eldrazi are great because they have cast triggers, so even if you get into this long control game where you start casting your threats, they are eventually castable on 10 and usually about 9 lands. And they have cast triggers that just obliterate control decks. And also their cast triggers are just good against most decks anyway. Mindslaver is ridiculous, and Exile 2 permanents, even if you don't get the indestructible 10/10 that abysses them, is great. The other threat, if we can look down there, is Magma Opus. I chose Magma Opus and as a like convenient 2-of because I can discard it to make a treasure if I need to, and if I'm on 5 mana, I have the line of discard Magma Opus and then use the treasure plus 3 other mana to crime it back. And so I get a 5 mana Magma Opus, which is broken. Like, that's just way better rate than it should be, and that usually will win the game or set up another crime. Speaking of setting up crime, Consider is the only cantrip in the deck. I figured it needed to go to the graveyard, so I chose it over Opt, and it needed to be instant speed, so I chose it over Sleight of Hand. That way it fills the graveyard for Fiery Impulse, which is our best 1 mana answer to Greasefang in the main deck. And Greasefang is just a bad matchup. It's gonna be troublesome, but Fiery Impulse gives us game against some of the aggro decks, and so we don't actually have too bad of a matchup against most aggro decks with the exception of Greasefang. Greasefang is nigh unwinnable. I think I'm 1 in 10 or less against Greasefang decks, and so I just have to accept that a good chunk of the sideboard is probably going to be dedicated to them, probably some number of Braids and Brazen Borrowers. It's bad. As far as the counterspell suite, for Izzet Charms, because they're also discard outlets and removal spells, they've been playing a lot of heavy lifting, and so that's been a really good choice. And the other one is Spell Pierce, because you have the line of, on turn 3, you cast Fable. If the token lives, you go to attacks with the token. You've discarded your big Eldrazi for turn 4. You've played your 4th land. You can play crime, and you can back it up with Spell Pierce. And that comes up more than you would think it does, given that it sounds like a pretty specific line. But you have a decent amount of filtering between Consider, Izzet Charm, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, that you can actually just loot through your deck and actually set up these realistic turn 4s. Speaking of turn 2 filtering, we can go back to our creatures and look at Malcolm. Malcolm is both another way to technically cheat things into play, but realistically, he is a looter for Reenact the Crime. And he does a good job of being instant speed. I did try a couple other things in the Malcolm slot and like the Fires of Victory slot, which is just another removal spell that I'm trying. I tried both Rona up to as a 4-of, and it was garbage. The fact that it is summoning sick is actually kind of atrocious, which sounds like just, okay, play more and eventually it won't get killed, but it got killed so much and it needed to loot multiple times because it comes down on turn 2 that it needs to live multiple turns, and that's just not as realistic as something like Malcolm and something like Fable that are much more likely to get off a single loot on a key turn. The other card I tried in that slot was Founding. And I thought Founding would be good. It's got a lot of relevant text, but the timing on when it does those relevant text is not where I want it to be. It doesn't mill at the right time. It flashes back things awkwardly. So it doesn't actually do what you want it to in a mana efficient way. In short, it doesn't really actually set up a crime. In the previous video, I showed off a couple of matchups where I had to crime twice to actually win the game. And while that looked like overkill, it frequently is necessary because the threats are not just, I crime this and I win the game on the spot. It's not Emrakul the Aeon's Torn, it's Emrakul the Promised End. And so you do have a good bit of game after you actually pull off your first crime. It's not absolutely game-winning in the same way that Greasefang Back Parhelion isn't technically game-winning, but it's almost certainly over. You still have to play the rest of the game. A key element and play pattern that's worth talking about with crime is that it is an instant, so I can play it at any time, which is great against the control decks who might tap out into a memory deluge at the end step and I'd just be able to crime back something I discarded that turn. But it also does not say my graveyard, which means that if your opponent ditches some big thing, like, again, against the Greasefang decks, if they ditch an Essica's Chariot with the intent of reanimating it, you can steal their Essica's Chariot, which that particular line does not happen that often, but I have stolen a couple of, big things from a couple of decks that are just, incidentals. I did take a Shieldred this morning, that chump blocked an Ulamog to be able to win a game, so that worked out, but there are some difficulties there. The other side is you do have to be able to leverage the fact that crime says from the cards that hit the graveyard this turn, which means if your opponent is playing Mill or Rogues or Liliana of the Veil or Cruxa, you can leverage the discard and mill on those cards to be able to crime when you need to. Although I suspect the Rogues is over-under probably not the best matchup because they have so much counter magic. You probably need to be able to back up your crimes with Spell Pierce is a charm. As far as the sideboard, I've been playing this in a lot of Best of One, but from the matches that seem to have a little difficulty, it's mostly the difference of your removal being blank or your counter spells being blank, because most of your counter spells counter non-creature spells. And to interact with that, you have cards that could be relevant. This is like a starting sideboard, so the numbers are not right, nothing's right. I could see things like Lightning Axe being relevant to both kill a Shieldred and discard something over some of my other options. But I could also see things like Niv Mizzet being relevant, where they pull out a bunch of removal in face of a bunch of counter magic, and you just be able to slam an uncounterable threat. Another option would be Hullbreaker Horror. That just seems like a good option, and you can absolutely crime it back. And then as far as some of the general sideboard utility, things like Dispel, Rending Volley, Malevolent Hermit to make your stuff uncounterable, and a Braid, between a Braid and Rending Volley giving you more text against Greasefang, and other decks that you could use that against, Mono White being a kind of tough matchup to be able to kill an Adeline or a Thalia. There's a lot of real options there, and I like the fact that this actually works. Rending Volley works through the Coppercoat guy, so you can actually pull up on an Adeline pretty easily. So I can see a lot of relevance to some of these choices, even if the numbers are not correct. Personally, if I was going to change the sideboard that I've currently built, I'd probably replace one of the Niv Mizzets with a Hullbreaker Horror. I'd probably replace one of the Brazen Borrowers with a copy of Lightning Axe just to try it against the Shieldred matchup. I realize this deck tech has gone all the way up to the 10-minute mark, but yeah, have fun with it. I hope this is actually helpful to somebody in terms of playing the deck. The deck does have some wacky and weird play patterns, but go out there, put some gray things into play, crime some people. Yeah, do that. Be gray, do crimes.